What if your disbelief isn't as rational as you think? This question, as strange as it may seem, invites thoughts for an examination of the underlying reasons behind personal atheism. The common narrative suggests that atheism arises primarily from a rational, logical rejection of religion or of religious belief. But what if this narrative is not only oversimplified but also fundamentally flawed? What if atheism, in many cases, is less about the rejection of the Bible's philosophical intention and more about the reaction against the distorted interpretations imposed onto the Bible by theology and theism? I want to explore the divergence between theology and the philosophical narrative within the Bible. By examining this difference, we can better understand how atheism might arise not from the Bible, because the atheist does not know Bible, but from the false narrative crafted by theology, which is all the atheist knows. This false narrative, rooted in the dogma of theism, often misrepresents the Bible's intended context, leading many to a path of disbelief that may be driven by deeper emotional and intellectual struggles rather than pure logic. To begin, it is essential to delineate the difference between theology and the Bible's philosophical intention. Theology, by definition, is the study of the nature of theos, and it often functions within the framework of theism, which is a belief system that posits the existence of a deity or deities who are involved in the creation and governance of the universe. Theism, therefore, constructs a worldview in which a divine being demands worship, obedience, and often sacrifices from its believers. In contrast, the Bible's philosophical intention, when examined without the lens of theological interpretation, presents a more simple and nuanced narrative. The Bible is not about a God or a deity. It is not a monolithic text. It contains diverse voices, perspectives, and intentions that reflect a range of human experiences that are familiar to religious experiences, yet written in this manner due to the philosophical implications beneath what is written. Rather than promoting a rigid theological framework, the Bible often critiques, mocks, or subverts the very systems of belief that theology seeks to uphold. Take, for example, the concept of sacrifice and offerings, which is central to many theological systems. Traditional theology often portrays God as a deity who demands sacrifices and offerings, whether blood or bloodless, as a means of securing divine favor or appeasing divine wrath. But the Bible itself complicates this narrative. In Amos 5:25, the prophet questions who Israel, while in the wilderness, offered sacrifices and offerings to, asking, "Have you offered unto me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel?" Similarly, in Jeremiah 7:22, it is stated, "For I spake not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices." These passages suggest that the demand for sacrifice was never divine in origin, but was instead a human imposition onto the intended will of the experience. This tension between the Bible's narrative and traditional theological interpretation is not an isolated phenomenon. Throughout the Bible, there are numerous instances where the text seems to subvert or critique the very religious practices that theology seeks to endorse. This raises an important question. If the Bible itself challenges the theological systems that have been built around it, then what is the true intention of the biblical narrative? The Bible's critique of theological systems can be seen as a deliberate attempt to distance itself from the rigid structures of theism. While theology often seeks to define and contain the supposedly divine within a set of doctrines, the Bible presents a more dynamic and fluid understanding of one's relationship to it. This fluidity is evident in the Bible's frequent call to reject religious formalism in favor of a more personal and intellectual relationship with its words. For instance, in the book of Micah, the prophet declares, "He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." Here, the emphasis is not on ritual or sacrifice, but on ethical, practical, and empathic living and humility. This stands in stark contrast to the theistic view that emphasizes ritual obedience as the primary means of relating to the divine. Again, the same author writing the book of Micah says, "Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" This is another critique against the theistic worldview. The Bible's philosophical intention, therefore, can be seen as a critique of the very religious systems that have historically claimed it as their foundation. Rather than endorsing a theology that demands blind obedience and ritualistic practices, the Bible invites readers to engage in a deeper, more reflective exploration of what it means to live for a relationship with its mind. This invitation is often obscured by the theological interpretations that have been imposed on the Bible over centuries. Given this distinction between theology and the Bible's philosophical intention, it becomes clear that many who turn to atheism may be reacting not to the Bible itself, but to the theological distortions that have been imposed upon it. The rigid, dogmatic systems of belief that characterize much of traditional theology can often feel intellectually and emotionally stifling, leading individuals to reject not only the theology but the Bible as well. However, this rejection may be rooted in a misunderstanding. If the Bible's true intention is not to uphold these theological systems but to critique them, then atheism, in many cases, may be a response to the misinterpretation of the Bible rather than the text itself. This raises the possibility that atheism is not a rejection of the Bible or of the philosophy within it, but a rejection of the false narrative crafted by theology. It is also important to recognize that atheism is not solely a product of intellectual reasoning. While many atheists may argue that their disbelief is grounded in logic and rationality, there are often deeper emotional struggles at play. These struggles may stem from personal experiences, cultural influences, or psychological factors that shape one's perception of religion and the Bible. For some, atheism may be a response to the pain or disillusionment caused by religious institutions or communities. For others, it may be a way of asserting autonomy and rejecting the authority of a belief system that feels oppressive or irrelevant. Still, for others, atheism may be a means of coping with existential questions and uncertainties that traditional theology fails to adequately address. In this context, the rejection of theism, and by extension the Bible, can be seen as a coping mechanism, a way of navigating complex thoughts and feelings without the constraints of a rigid belief system. However, if the Bible's true intention is not to impose such constraints but to offer a more nuanced and flexible understanding of the divine, then the rejection of the Bible may be based on a misunderstanding of its philosophical purpose. Yet, in the ongoing exploration of atheism's roots, an intriguing paradox emerges. Those who identify as atheists, in their rejection of theological systems, may actually be aligning themselves more closely with the Bible's philosophical intention than they realize. This proposition may seem counterintuitive, especially to those who view atheism as the antithesis of religious belief. However, when we look at the nature of both atheism and the Bible's critique of theological and theistic systems, a logical conclusion becomes evident. Atheism, in its rejection of the religion or theism as presented by traditional theology, is not only a rational stance, but also one that echoes the Bible's own rejection of these same systems. At the core of atheism is the denial of the existence of a deity or deities. This denial is often directed against the concept of a divine being as defined by theistic theology, a being that demands worship, obedience, and ritual sacrifice. Yet the Bible itself frequently subverts and critiques these very theological constructs. The God that theology often presents, a deity demanding unyielding devotion and ritualistic offerings, is not the God that the Bible ultimately portrays. When atheists reject this theistic notion of God, they are, in essence, rejecting a concept that the Bible itself does not fully support. The passages from Amos and Jeremiah, for example, highlight a voice questioning the legitimacy of sacrifices and offerings, suggesting that these practices were not divinely ordained, but human inventions. In this sense, atheists who reject a deity constructed by theological systems are not rejecting the Bible's portrayal of the divine. Rather, they are rejecting a misrepresentation of the divine, a portrayal that the Bible itself challenges. This leads to a fascinating realization. In the rejection of the theistic God, atheists may actually be upholding the Bible's critique of theological systems. The Bible, in its natural, parable, and philosophical context, does not support the rigid, dogmatic God that theology often endorses. Instead, it presents a more philosophical view of belief that has somehow come to be associated with theism. The atheist rejection of a theological deity therefore aligns with the Bible's own stance against these misrepresentations. However, while this alignment might suggest that atheism is a rational stance, there is a deeper irony at play. By defining themselves in opposition to a theistic God, a concept that the Bible itself does not fully endorse, atheists may inadvertently trap themselves in the same intellectual and emotional bind as theists. Atheism, in this context, becomes less about a true rejection of belief and more about a reactionary stance against a belief system that is already critiqued within the Bible. One just doesn't know that it is already critiqued within the Bible due to the religious trauma caused by theological suppositions. This reactionary stance can lead to an irrational position. If the Bible itself does not support the theological concept of a demanding ritualistic deity, then atheism's rejection of such a deity is, in a way, redundant. Atheists, by opposing a divine figure that the Bible does not fully endorse, are engaging in a form of intellectual shadowboxing, fighting against a construct that is not truly representative of the Bible's philosophical intention. Moreover, this reactionary stance can lead to another form of self-indulgence. Just as theology can lead believers to mindlessly indulge in ritualistic practices, atheism can lead non-believers to mindlessly indulge in the practice of opposition. The energy spent in rationally opposing theological suppositions can become an all-consuming endeavor, one that drains intellectual and emotional resources without leading to any deeper understanding or fulfillment. In this sense, atheism, like theism, becomes another trap, one that ensnares the mind in a cycle of opposition and reaction without ever confronting the true nature of the Bible's philosophical ideals. The focus on rejecting a theological deity diverts attention away from the Bible's more profound and subtle critiques of religious systems and the deeper practical and philosophical questions it raises. The solution to this intellectual impasse lies in confronting the Bible directly, not as a theological text, but as a philosophical work. By stripping away the layers of theological interpretation, one can engage with the Bible on its own terms and uncover the true nature of its critique of religious systems. This engagement requires a shift from reaction to reflection, from a stance of opposition to one of exploration. When the mind confronts the Bible in this way, it can begin to comprehend the philosophical ideals that the text seeks to convey. These ideals often stand in stark contrast to the practices and beliefs endorsed by traditional theology. For example, the Bible's emphasis on cultivating personal devotional intellect and character challenges the ritualistic and dogmatic practices that theology often promotes. The Bible's critique of religious formalism and its call for a genuine and reasonable experience suggest a philosophy that is more concerned with the quality of one's thoughts and feelings than with adherence to ritual or dogma. This confrontation with the Bible's true intentions can lead to a more meaningful and intellectually satisfying experience. Rather than indulging in the opposition to theological constructs, the mind can engage in a deeper exploration of the Bible's philosophical messages. This exploration will reveal to the individual the intended context of the Bible's words. Both atheism and theism, when understood as reactionary or dogmatic stances, represent two sides of the same coin. Both can trap the mind in cycles of indulgence, whether in the practice of ritual and obedience or in the practice of opposition and denial. Neither stance fully engages with the Bible's philosophical intention, which critiques both the excesses of theological systems and the reactionary stances that arise in response to them. In this light, atheism, when it arises as a reaction to theology rather than as a reasoned engagement with the Bible's philosophy, can be seen as an irrational stance. It rejects a deity that the Bible itself does not fully acknowledge, and in doing so, it falls into the same trap of self-indulgence that it seeks to avoid. True intellectual freedom and fulfillment does not come from reacting against theology, but from engaging directly with the Bible's philosophical wisdom. A wisdom that challenges both theistic and atheistic dogmas alike.